The Fortress of Verdun, 1916, an unprecedented test site for industrial extermination. To understand the mechanism, we must analyze the data from the year before. By late 1915, the Western Front was a fixed equation, a static line of 25,000 miles of trenches. The cost of this stalemate, 1 million dead. The question was technical. How to overcome 25,000 miles of barbed wire? The answer was not a breakthrough. It was systematic exhaustion. The deadlock was a product of mechanics. Traditional tactics met new technology. A cavalry charge met a Maxim gun. An infantry advance met rapid-fire artillery. The breach opens. A brass casing ejects, its metallic sound lost in the concussion. The barrel recoils. A new shell is already chambered. The mathematics were absolute. Industrial warfare produced industrial casualties. 1 million dead was not just a number. It was the complete demographic erasure of a major European city of the period, like Birmingham. Yet the High Command repeated the same failed assaults. A larger attack followed a failed one. The result was constant. Frontal infantry charges against fortified machine gun positions were a tactical impossibility. The equation was broken, so one man rewrote it. German Chief of Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn. His past as Prussian Minister of War taught him a cold calculus. For him, armies were not collections of men. They were logistical tables, a resource to be expended. Falkenhayn's primary target was the British Army. But Britain was an island, untouchable by land. The only way to cripple British power was to destroy its continental sword, the French army. The front could not be broken, so don't break it. The new strategy weaponized the stalemate itself. It was not about a breakthrough, it was about a trap. The doctrine was attrition, to bleed them white. Concentrate overwhelming artillery on a single symbolic point. A target the French command could not afford to lose. Force them to feed division after division into a prepared killing ground. The goal was not territory. It was a favorable kill ratio, a mathematical process to dismantle an army. Falkenhayn began his selection of the target. The equation was set. It needed a location, a point on the map where geography itself became the weapon. The choice fell on a sector near the city of Verdun. Why this specific section? The answer was not in its symbolic value. It was in the evidence, the maps, the railway timetables. First, geography. After the fall of Saint-Mihiel in 1914, the French front line bulged into German territory, a salient, exposed, attackable from three sides. Second, and more critical, logistics. The entire Verdun sector, a fortress city, hung by a thread. One single road from Bar-le-Duc, and one single narrow-gauge railway. This railway was the sector's primary artery. It was also a bottleneck. Trains stood in line for hours, brakes screeched, overloaded. An entire army's survival depended on this single, fragile track. The math was simple. Defending the sector required a minimum of 2,000 tons of supplies every day. The narrow-gauge line could never deliver that volume. Resupply was mathematically impossible. German intelligence knew this. Their own logistics were superior. On the German side of the salient, 14 standard-gauge railway lines stood ready. The French had one. German planners studied French logistics. The French High Command was busy with its own calculations, fatal ones. Verdun was more than a fortress. It was a symbol. A name etched into history by the Treaty of Verdun in 843. The birthplace of two nations, France and Germany. For the French, it was an icon of national identity, of resistance. Taking it meant spitting in the face of the Republic. German strategists counted on this, but the French High Command saw only recent history. The year was 1914. The Belgian forts at Liège fell in days, crushed by German heavy artillery. This data drove their decision. Fortresses were obsolete. The analysis was a catastrophic error. Belgian forts were built of unreinforced concrete. Verdun's fortifications were modern, steel-reinforced concrete, sand cushions to absorb impact. A critical technical difference. The High Command dismissed it. The order went out. The forts were to be disarmed. Heavy guns were removed from their armored turrets. Ammunition stocks were transported away from the front. The garrisons were reduced to maintenance crews. The hollowed-out defenses met the morning of February 21, 1916. At 7:15 a.m., the new reality arrived. 1,200 German guns opened fire, simultaneously, across a narrow 12-mile front. The concentration of firepower was unprecedented. Among them were the giants, the 420mm Big Bertha siege howitzers, and long-range 380mm naval guns. How much steel did it take to fracture reinforced concrete? German High Command had a technical answer. The salvos from naval batteries provided it. The process of loading a Big Bertha was pure industrial mechanics. A crane hoisted the shell into position. A massive, threaded breech block swung shut, sealing the chamber. The crew recoiled, hands over ears, mouths open to equalize pressure. The firing lanyard was pulled. The shockwave was a physical blow, a silent punch that compressed the lungs. A single 420mm shell weighed almost a ton. This was not an explosion, it was a kinetic impact, the equivalent of a small car dropped from a skyscraper onto a single point of concrete. The bombardment was not a chaotic storm, it was a system, a machine. The Germans called it Trommelfeuer, Drumfire. The fire was walked systematically across the French lines. First, the forward trenches were pulverized into dust, then the support trenches, then the command posts. The barrage lifted from the first line of defense and moved methodically to the next. The logic came from a previous disaster, Fort Lenin. A single German shell struck its main magazine. 12 tons of gunpowder detonated in one flash. The fort and its garrison were erased. Over the ruins hung the suffocating smell of vaporized explosive. A lesson was learned, the wrong one. To prevent a repeat, French High Command issued a directive. All major forts around Verdun were to be disarmed. Their guns were removed, ammunition stocks depleted, garrisons cut. The first hits from the German 420mm shells exposed the result. The fortress system was hollow. Nowhere was this more true than Fort Douaumont, the keystone of the entire defense. Its garrison was reduced from over 800 combat engineers to just 50 men. 50 elderly reservists commanded by a single warrant officer. Officers' reports warning of the exposure were ignored. The German ground assault was about to begin. The German breach of Verdun's concrete shell triggered a systemic collapse. But the fall of Europe's most powerful fort began with a single man. Fort Douaumont was considered impregnable. It fell to 90 German infantrymen without a single shot fired. The man was Sergeant Kuhns. He climbed through a breach in the wall. Alone. He moved through dark, empty corridors, guided only by a sound. The echo of a single French gun, firing blindly into the chaos outside. Kuhns found the gun crew. 4 men. He captured them and locked them in a room. He walked further into the fortress. He found the mess hall. Food was still on the tables. Kuhns sat down and ate. His reinforcements arrived soon after. 90 Germans secured the entire structure. No casualties. No resistance. The fall of Douaumont sent a shockwave through the French High Command. The Germans celebrated. They would not celebrate for long. For the next 8 months, France launched repeated counterattacks to recapture the fort they had so easily lost. The cost was 100,000 casualties, the equivalent of an entire French city's population at the time. Annihilated. In just one of many attacks, 12,000 men were sent to take back the fort. The cost of this failure was measured in human lives. But the system itself was measured in concrete and steel, a fortress network built to control the Meuse River and its surrounding hills. How did this defensive machine operate? 2 concentric rings, designed for interlocking artillery fire. The outer ring held 22 large forts positioned on high ground. The inner ring consisted of 6 smaller forts, the final line of defense before the city. Between them, a dense web of fortified positions. Each structure was a shell of reinforced concrete. The walls were 2.5 meters thick, every passage sealed by heavy steel doors. This architecture was precise. The loss of a single fort created a blind spot, a fatal vulnerability in the network. Every fort was engineered to cover its neighbors with artillery fire. By February 26th, the cost was catastrophic. 24,000 French casualties, 25,000 German, nearly 50,000 men lost in just 5 days. But the interlocking defense system became a trap. A single administrative decision had already hollowed out its most critical node. Fort Douaumont, the largest stronghold, built on the highest ground. From there, artillery could be directed across the entire battlefield. It was designed to hold 1,000 men. It held 60. The garrison was a skeleton crew of middle-aged reservists. An earlier order had stripped the fort of its main armament and personnel. Each man was now expected to control a zone 15 times larger than standard regulations. The strongest fort in Europe was a concrete shell. On the afternoon of February 25th, a German pioneer sergeant reached the fort's moat. Felix Otto Kunz, leading 10 combat engineers. He scanned the outer wall. He found a breach. A German shell had punched a hole through the reinforced concrete. Kunz saw the crumbled edges, the exposed steel bars. He made a decision. He ordered his men to go in. The path to Fort Douaumont had to be cleared first. A path 8 miles long, forged with fire. By February 24th, the French outer defenses were shattered, but not broken. How were the remaining fortifications breached? The German command deployed a new asset. 96 flamethrower teams were brought into the battle. The effect on fixed positions was absolute. Men ran from the trenches, their clothes and hair on fire. The air filled with the smell of burning wool and flesh. The advance was methodical, industrial. By February 25th, the entire 8-mile outer line had collapsed. The French divisions holding that sector effectively ceased to exist. They were erased from the lists of combat-effective units. But clearing that 8-mile perimeter with fire required a preliminary step. A total paralysis of French logistics. The method? Artillery. In one wooded sector, German stormtroopers ignored their orders. The command was to advance cautiously, to probe. Instead, they attacked. A brutal 5-hour firefight erupted in the shattered trees. This chaos was the direct product of the preceding 9 hours. 9 hours of continuous heavy shelling from over 1,200 German guns. The bombardment was not just destructive, it was physiological. Continuous shock waves create barotrauma, physical injury to internal organs from pressure. The nervous system degrades, coordination fails. Soldiers were broken before the infantry even moved. Roughly half of the French defenders survived the barrage. They were alive, but they were not intact. Most suffered from concussion, disorientation, and internal bleeding. Their resistance was fragmented, desperate, but unexpectedly fierce. It drew the German vanguard into a meat grinder. After 5 hours of close-quarters combat, the stormtroopers finally broke the French line. 12,000 men were sent to retake the position. The assault was a tactical failure. In 36 hours, the attacking force was pushed back. The battlefield had devolved. Concrete forts were gone. The fight was now in a landscape of mud-filled craters. Here, conventional warfare ceased to function. Why did infantry discard their rifles? In the tight confines of a shell hole, there was no room to aim, no space to fire. The standard-issue rifle became useless weight. The primary weapons became grenades and sharpened shovels. The attack protocol was brutally simple. A soldier lobs a grenade into a section of collapsed trench. The assault team rushes in during the concussion. If defenders survived, the fight continued in the mud, with bare hands. This regression forced a chemical escalation. First, German artillery used tear gas, an irritant designed to force soldiers from cover. Then, they deployed phosgene, This was not an irritant, it was a choking agent. Heavier than air, the colorless gas settled at the bottom of trenches, a suffocating invisible layer. Its mechanism was direct, acute pulmonary edema. The lungs fill with fluid. Soldiers drowned on dry land. The final tally for the failed assault was absolute. Almost 6,000 casualties in 36 hours. By late May 1916, the tactical environment had degraded beyond combat. It was biological collapse. Soldiers now used the bodies of their comrades as building material for parapets. The first casualty was water. Clean water was non-existent. Carrying parties were systematically targeted, shot to pieces in open ground. Thirst became a tactical weapon. One German soldier documented the result. A man, driven insane, crawling towards a shell crater. The water is covered in a film of green slime. A bloated corpse floats in it. The soldier drinks. This was not an isolated incident. It was a statistical norm. With thousands of unburied bodies decomposing into the mud, the groundwater became saturated with bacteria. Dysentery was no longer a risk. It was a certainty. The survivors who came out of the line were hollowed out. They were described as silent skeletons. This battlefield decay was a symptom. The disease was the strategy. A plan conceived by General Erich von Falkenhayn. The tactical formula was brutal and simple. First, artillery. Days of heavy preparation, firing millions of shells to obliterate the French front line. The barrage pulverized the trenches, but it did not cut the barbed wire. How to overcome this positional deadlock? Millions of shells proved powerless against surviving wire defenses. The German infantry would advance. They would take the first line. Then they stopped. The second line of defense was waiting. Intact wire. Intact machine guns. The density of fire from these positions made attacker numbers irrelevant. Any numerical advantage became a mathematical fiction on open ground. The assault wave was mowed down. A French counterattack reclaimed the lost territory. The front line did not move. The only change was the body count. The German High Command simply ordered the next wave forward. The frontal assaults on the right bank had failed. German infantry advanced into a tactical stalemate. A pivot was required. The new axis of attack, the left bank of the Meuse River. The reason was geography. On the western bank, French artillery held two key elevations, Hill 304 and a ridge named Le Mort Homme, the Dead Man's Hill. From these heights, French gunners had a perfect, unobstructed view of the German formations advancing below. This flanking fire created an ideal fire sack, a killing zone that physically blocked any German progress on the right bank. Every charge was decimated. The conclusion for the German staff was absolute. The advance could not continue. Those guns had to be silenced. On March 6th, the operation expanded. After a bombardment as heavy as the one that opened the battle, the attack shifted. The objective was singular: seize Hill 304 and Le Mort Homme, and clear the French artillery behind them. As German artillery pivoted to the left bank, General Pétain organized the French defense. His response was not a new tactic. It was an industrial solution. A single, narrow road connected Verdun to the town of Bar-le-Duc, 35 miles. This road became the sole artery for the entire front. Pétain turned it into a conveyor belt of men and material. The sound was constant, a non-stop day and night roar of thousands of engines, and the grinding of heavy tires on gravel. Columns moved in a continuous stream. Any vehicle that broke down was pushed into a ditch. The flow could not be interrupted. It was the throughput of this artery, not infantry tactics, that saved the Verdun front from collapse. The scale was unprecedented. At any given moment, 8,000 vehicles were on that road. They transported 2.5 million men. They delivered 2 million tons of supplies. They evacuated 800,000 wounded. Pétain's second mechanism was a system of rotation. Divisions were not left to disintegrate. They were cycled. German assault units consistently faced fresh French troops. The threshold for withdrawal was purely mathematical. A division was pulled from the line after reaching 50% casualties. This constant resupply allowed France to hold its positions. But the ground they defended was being systematically erased. The next 3 months became some of the most savage fighting of the war. Positions changed hands multiple times, often in a single day. The very concept of a trench ceased to exist. Constant, heavy artillery fire pulverized the landscape. The ground became a moonscape of overlapping shell craters, a terrain of mud, water, and human remains. Soldiers lived inside these craters. Shallow ditches scraped into the earth connected one hole to the next. Water pooled in the bottoms. A thin layer of ice formed on the surface. Protection from meteorological factors was non-existent. The artillery concentration was absolute. It sheared 23 feet off the top of Hill 304. Surviving German infantry were driven underground into the concrete vaults of Fort Douaumont. Average life expectancy here, 14 days. What happens when you lock 3,000 men in a bunker built for 600? The infrastructure becomes a powder keg. Fort Douaumont was engineered for a garrison of 600. By May, 3,000 German soldiers were packed inside. Dark concrete corridors became living quarters. Canisters of flamethrower fuel were stacked next to unexploded French shells. The air was a sharp, eye-stinging mix of cordite and unwashed bodies in a space with no ventilation. Exceeding the design capacity by 5 times nullified every safety protocol for ammunition storage. The disaster was mathematical. It was inevitable. On the morning of May 8th at 4:30 a.m., a small group of soldiers initiated the sequence. They needed to heat coffee. They overturned wooden cordite cases to build a makeshift stove. May 8th. A spark from an improvised stove leaps. It finds the flamethrower fuel. A deadly chain reaction begins. Thick black smoke floods the lower corridors. Soldiers below choke. They panic. They run for the upper levels, but the smoke has blackened their faces, unrecognizable. Troops on the upper floor see dark figures rushing up the stairs. They believe they are French colonial soldiers. The cry goes out. The blacks are coming. The Germans throw hand grenades at their own men. The grenades land in a depot of captured French shells. The first detonation ignites the main grenade and detonator stores. The blast wave, amplified by concrete tunnels, has nowhere to go. It multiplies. 3 massive sequential explosions rip the fort apart.